We are raising a conceptual, logical problem which can only have a conceptual, logical solution. By saying things are different in different places, you have not answered the question. For instance, Neera, here is how they contradict themselves. You cannot separate the religious from the secular, she says. It takes the example of marriage. That was the first sentence. Second sentence. But when there is a conflict, one has to prioritize. Contradiction in terms. Because if question of priority comes in between any two objects, you are able to distinguish the two objects. The first sentence says you cannot distinguish between the religious and the secular. Now, which of the statement is true? Problem with contradictory statements is this: you can derive any statement whatsoever, and that's exactly what they're doing. You say one thing at one time, negate it the next time. Now, be consistent. Either it is possible, or tell me why it is good to be inconsistent. One of the two. Either you can distinguish conceptually between the religious and the secular. If yes, what are the criteria on which you're going to distinguish? If you do not distinguish, then you cannot say there's a religious-secular conflict. You cannot say there's prioritization. In fact, you cannot speak about either religion or the secular, which means basically, as Wittgenstein said, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. So choose one or the other.
Society is far too complex and separated into neat categories.
So there is always a very, very difficult problem which one must understand. The actual existing world is so complex, so connected in so many ways, and contradictory and inconsistent in so many ways, that in order for you to try and grasp that, you start with analytical categories that separate in order to be able to come to understand that complexity. But you must not make the mistake of thinking that your analytical categories, which must be understood, and differentiations and so on, must remain cast in stone, and that unless you're able to make these sharp distinctions, they must allow you, if you like, to start off. You start with the notions of culture, you start with notions of religion, you start with notions of society. But you fundamentally recognize that your initial and your separation in your categories and so on must help you to develop a deeper understanding of the world. And there is no fundamental criteria in many cases when you're dealing with highly complex issues that will enable to say, oh, you're right and we are wrong. What basically is the situation you have to consider. How do then you judge or adjudicate, if you like, between different conceptual arguments and this debate over here? There is one, which is the internal logic of your concepts. Two, your empirical controls in terms of how here. And three, ultimately, the balance of plausibility in argument about understanding and explaining the world. Take, for example, in international relations theory, the highly logical consistency of Kenneth Waltz's paradigm. Logically consistent internally, exceptionally high marks. Explanatory power, limited. Explanatory scope, even more limited. Your ability, in other words, what it does is, it starts from assumptions and reaches conclusions which are entirely consistent. But its assumptions itself are highly debatable. One of the points that we are making over here is that even in making these discussions here, and therefore what you have to do is that you have to realize that what you're doing when you're talking, you're not going to be able to define religion. There's such an incredible debate, even in the West, about how you should properly define religion and what they are. How do you define ways in which it will be universally acceptable? So these are, if you like, the problem of definition, these things, is that you can cut too narrowly and exclude. You can cut too broadly, because that's what you're doing. You're cutting applied, but we can't avoid that. We have to start with definitions, but we take them as working definitions. And then we proceed along those lines, and then we try and understand and see what explains the world better. And we try to do that for a particular reason. This often gets lost. And that we want to do that because we want to actually intervene in the world to move towards progress. And the notion of progress, of course, in modernity is profoundly different from the more static societies, necessarily the more static societies in which these major religions and systems were born. So that, I believe, is a question. But I'm happy to go ahead to...
Can we respond to that?
Yeah, sorry.
Because, again, this is a problem that keeps coming up. The world is complex. Yeah, of course the world is complex. But it is not contradictory. Nothing in the world is contradictory except sentences, statements, which are either true or false. Those can be contradictory. Nothing else in the world can be contradictory. Of course. A contradiction is a property of two sentences. One contradicts the other. One is true, the other is also true, but they contradict each other. Right? Okay, let's go on. Then, the complexity of the world does not mean that we have to use vague, obscure concepts. In, say, a nuclear reaction or an object falling down, a leaf falling down from a tree is incredibly complex. We have no clue about all the variables involved. We honestly don't have a clue why the leaf falls at this particular time. But we can predict its route according to certain variables because we have a theory which has certain relatively clear concepts, such as gravitation, mass, force, well, we can go on. Now, to use the complexity of the world to argue that we cannot have clear concepts is to argue against knowledge, basically.
Narrow concepts,
No, narrow and broad, what does that mean? Is it gravitation a narrow concept or is it a broad concept? Is species, is it narrow or broad? You cannot measure it, no?